So I bring my own walk-on music. We're going to talk a little bit about Zero Trust and Teams. And we kind of will get our things started off. By the way, that was my, I'm from Chicago. I'm from the Chicagoland area, I should say. How many people here are from the Chicago area? How many people understood why it was important that I didn't say I was from Chicago, but from the Chicagoland area? I actually was born in St. Louis. This is not part of my talk, but I was born in St. Louis. I've lived here since I was 4. I grew up in a suburb called Villa Park, which spelled backwards is crap alive. And I currently live out in Lisle, known for the Arboretum, but I lived on the north side for 20 plus years. Anyway, so that song, by the way, so there's going to be themes connected to music and stuff. That was Urge Overkill, a fantastic 90s Chicago band. But that's about the extent of the talk that has to do with Urge Overkill. So we think about DevOps, for me or whatever. I mean, who thinks, what's the hardest thing about DevOps when we're DevOpsing? What's the hardest thing here, right? Probably like the auto scaling, whatever. No, it's people, right? Yeah. So when we look at, DevOps has been around for however long, before lunch, if you were in this room, Schaefer, took responsibility for stealing DevOps, and it's fairly true. We've been doing this for a bit of time. And so when we think about what DevOps was for, a lot of the things when we talk about DevOps, we talk about breaking down silos, right? How many people have kind of heard that in the context of DevOps? We're like, silos and bad, okay? Let's break them down or whatever. But we also kind of made some new ones, right? We created DevOps teams. And I'm not here to praise DevOps teams, but to bury them, or maybe it's the other way around. That said, I'm not here to say that if you're on a team called the DevOps team or you're a DevOps engineer, that's a bad thing. We're here to get work done. But one of the things that happened was we said, okay, we're going to work together, we're going to cross-create, and we just sort of kind of shifted things around. So, hey, I'm Maddie. A couple things to know about me. I love punk music and 90s alternative, if that wasn't clear from my walk-on music. I also love improv. I studied improv here in Chicago, 20 plus years at Players Workshop, Improv Olympic, been an improv coach, a bunch of other stuff. Also, when it comes to improv, I'm a great example of those who can do, those who can't teach. I love dogs. I have 2 great Australian Shepherds. I've decided, my son has told me that, my other kids talk about what they want to do when they grow up and they're going to have families and everything. And my one son is like, I'm going to become a vet and I'm going to buy a house in the middle of nowhere and adopt like 10 dogs. And I said, I'm going to come and live with you. And I work at a company called Aiven. So we're not going to talk about all 4 of those things. We're actually going to kind of focus in this as a little bit of some metaphors and some framework. If you don't like either of those things, it's fine. We're still going to talk about technology and high-performing teams. So David Woods talks about this idea, and he says, resilience is a verb. One fun thing that happened, not many fun things happened during the lockdown in 2020, but one thing that was interesting is, I'm a developer advocate. I give a lot of conference talks. I was doing a lot of those at home. Same time that my kids were e-learning in the other room. So my kids got to hear me give talks quite a bit. And one day after giving a talk, my son, who was, I think, 11 at the time, came up and he goes, Daddy, I was listening to your talk. And you said resilience is a verb. Actually, it's a noun. And then he was assigned 7 different PDFs to read, and he has never been a reply guy to me since. But the idea, and we're going to be talking about ideas that come from the field of resilience engineering, which is not a new idea. It's not a new thing. It's a practice that's been around for 5-6 decades, commonly practiced in areas like nuclear safety, medicine, air traffic control, and also now tech, where we decided we invented it 6 years ago, as we do. So in this idea of thinking about resilience as a verb, these are things that we do, right? They're things that we do to express resilience that exists in our system. And when a lot of times people talk about resilience, and they'll say, especially vendors, right? They'll say, hey, if you use our tool, we'll make your network resilient. We'll make your Kubernetes cluster resilient. We'll make your database resilient. And that's a bunch of BS, because you know what you can't make resilient is a purely technical system. And we're going to talk about what resilience means and why that matters, because resilience is expressed by the people, right? And this is going to become clear. So I'm going to be a little pedantic, but trust me, we're going somewhere. So Resilience is kind of made up of these 4 factors, about the idea of rebound, robustness, graceful extensibility, and sustained adaptability. We're going to kind of talk about what do these things mean. So rebound, first of all, is returning to normal after a surprise. This is usually expressed through work that's done ahead of time. This is how our system goes back to normal after something happened that wasn't supposed to happen, right? We had an incident, we had a surprise. How do we bring it back? You think about a rubber band, right? That's the rebound. Okay, so that's an important way of that resilience is measured, if you will, or that we can express it or understand it, is our ability to rebound. When we think about robustness, this is usually what people, when they say they're making a system resilient, they really mean they're making it robust. And robustness is the ability to withstand and absorb well-modeled disturbances. Things that we know can happen, maybe known knowns. The reality is we have a lot of unknown unknowns. I think back to, again, I love that I can make, how many people in here, remind me, how many people are local-ish? Okay, cool. I love that I can make local references and I don't have to explain them. So I used to work for apartments.com. How many people remember apartments.com and Classified Ventures? Anybody worked at Classified Ventures? Cars? Okay. I carry a little bit of maybe baggage about cars.com because apartments.com was always the sort of bitter young sibling of Cars, but it's okay. We were still awesome. Anyway, I remember not a non-zero number of times, we would have some type of an incident, some type of an outage. And my boss, the CTO, would come to me and say, Matt, why weren't you monitoring for that? And I'd say, Pat, because until last night, I didn't know it could happen, right? So that's the idea of robustness, is the things we know can happen, our ability to withstand those. And that's real important. And then reliability comes out of that. Now, graceful extensibility is our ability to stretch beyond those operational boundaries, right? This is as opposed to brittleness. So if we're only thinking about our robustness, we can only withstand things we know. Challenges to those operational abilities, building outside of that envelope, is our graceful extensibility. This requires people, right? I don't care what you think about AI or wherever that goes. This requires creativity and intuition and all the things that the humans can do because we didn't predict it. And then this culminates in what we call sustained adaptability. There we go. Which this is our goal for resilience, which is the ability to manage these adaptive capacities over long time scales, right? You know, if you've seen Courtney, who's giving a talk tomorrow, rant about MTTR. Lots of us like to talk about it. The problem with mean time to resolution is it's all incidents and isolation. We think about the long time scales, right? We're in the business of longevity here. So we're trying to enhance and express is our sustained adaptability. So why are we talking so much about resilience and all these specific pieces? And it's because the systems we're building are socio-technical systems. If you've been sitting in this room for most of the day, this is at least the third time you've heard socio-technical brought up, which was kind of great, and I loved Andrew gave a good definition of it, which I'm not going to repeat. But really what this boils down to is all of the systems that we create and manage and operate and utilize are made up of technology, and they are made up of people. The people who built them, the people who run them, the people who use them. And they're constantly changing, right? We think about exposure to users. This goes back to what Charity was talking about earlier, and that the idea of that until you get something in front of users, it's not valuable because we can think of all the things we want. Our users are gonna find ways to do things that never occurred to us, right? All those other places. So it really comes down to how the people come into things. So in the resilience engineering community, when we think about the people involved in systems that we're working with, we sometimes refer to the blunt end and the sharp end. And this is not a value statement. It's not necessarily a blunt is negative. Now that's what I said, it's not a value statement, but if you look at the pictures I chose to put up here, I'm making a value statement. That's Malcolm McLaren, who is the instigator of the Sex Pistols and the manager, and people might have opinions, and that's Kim Gordon, who is amazing. But at the blunt end, these are people in the organization that generally tend to be in a higher level leadership position, but the point is they're removed from the day-to-day work. They're upstream decision makers. That's not a bad thing, we have to have that. But then when we look at the sharp end in a system, the people at the sharp end are the people directly engaged in the work. If you've heard the term chop wood, carry water, right? These are generally speaking individual contributors. You can still be a manager and be at the sharp end, but we're closer to where the work is happening. So if we want to take away from talking about tech, you might say, you know, the administrator of a hospital is at the blunt end, the surgeon is at the sharp end, ha ha ha. And then the same thing, we think about it, our SREs, our developers, we work at the sharp end. And you need both parts of these systems, but they come in different places. So the thing that's important about the sharp end to keep in mind, so people at the sharp end, and especially within technology, this is true. These are people who are constantly building and destroying systems, right? Our systems are in a constant state of flux. If we're at the sharp end, we're constantly building and destroying these systems. And at the sharp end, there is really strong signaling amongst other members of that part. We talk to each other in very high fidelity, right? We have a lot of, not only is it signaling between us, it's signaling between us and the system. The closer we are to the system, the better we understand it, or at least the better signal we have towards it. People at the sharp end know how to improve systems based on strain, because we have those signals, we're closer. And the thing that matters here is, the sharp end will do all these things naturally when given ownership. And a great example of this happened during the necessity of shift to remote work that happened very, very quickly in, you know, the 17-week-long month of March, 2020. And it happened so fast that there wasn't time for, in large organizations, to say, this is how we are going to work remotely as a team. This is all of our good practices and all of this. The teams just had to do it. And they did, right? And they figured out the right way to work in their team. And then we screwed it all up and learned no lessons from all of that and went back to trying to tell people how they have to do work. So that's great. Side note, I will do a little bit of explaining of some of these references. So this is, the reason this guy is up on the screen in this particular picture, so there's a punk music festival here in Chicago every year called Riot Fest, which if you haven't seen the lineup for this year, it's an absolute banger. Go check it out. But 2 years ago, I was there, and I was sitting down, and I was eating a corn dog with my friend, and someone ran up, and he was like, rah, 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 and he asked if he could take a selfie with me, and I was like, okay, I don't know what just happened, right? I get that sometimes in an airport with people who like my podcast, but which is also weird. And he runs off, and my friend Kat sitting next to me, she's laughing. She goes, you know what just happened? And I go, no, what just happened? She goes, you thought you were Fat Mike from NoFX. Well, that's Fat Mike. We don't look really anything alike. But also last year at Riot Fest, someone else thought I was Fat Mike, and NoFX wasn't even playing. So this year I'm going to get a t-shirt that says I'm not Fat Mike. Anyway, so command and control is a fallacy. So command and control is this idea that we pass orders down from the top. And I'm not a big fan of using military metaphors for things, but this is so common in organizational culture that we're going to extend from it. So command and control is like, up here at the top, we're going to dictate all the way down how things happen. And if you ask people who are a fan of it, they'll say, well, this is how militaries work that are very effective. And I was like, there's not a military on this planet that's followed command and control in the last 200 years, right? Because it doesn't work. What modern militaries do is something called maneuver warfare, right? Because again, the sharp end knows what's up, and they have the situational awareness. The general sitting back there doesn't see all this stuff, so we give outcomes. But yet, within our organizations, we still want to say, at the executive level, we're going to drive the how, right, as opposed to the why. And I'm going to talk about how we can fix that in our organizations. Conway's law, if you're not familiar, is the posit that your systems architecture or your company's software architecture is a reflection of your organization's communication patterns. Sometimes people say it's a reflection of your org chart, which is kind of saying the same thing. So again, if you have high degrees of communication, you're going to have systems that trust each other a lot more. If you've kind of got a pathological communication organization, that's going to be reflected in how you design software. So when we think about Conway's law, I like to kind of think about flipping it around to think about how we can use models of software design to think about how we want an organization to work. Now, as I go into this next analogy, if you will, bear in mind, I spent 2+ decades working in operations. I am not a software engineer. I'm going to talk about software design. If you are someone who primarily has a background in software, I'm probably going to get some of it a little bit wrong, but this is creative license, so just to be aware of that, right? So I like to think about how we design services in like a service-oriented architecture as a metaphor for how our teams can work. And this is not necessarily microservice perspective. I know that a lot of SOA is out of date and they're not going to get into a SOAP versus REST, but just think about service architecture and how that can be echoed into how teams can work together. So if we think in a service-oriented architecture, we have this idea of a service contract, right? So we have a service that has its logic, and then I am a consumer of that service, right? I'm like, cool, there's a service out there where I can go do an order lookup, let's say, or I can get map geos or something like that. I don't give a crap how that works. It's not my business to know, right? It's abstracted away from me, but what we have, the reason that that can work is because there's a well-defined service contract that tells me as a consumer, if you send a message this way, you will get back this, right? So we have an agreement that the inputs will look like this and the outputs will look like that. And as long as that contract is maintained, on this side, I can do whatever the hell I want. And it doesn't matter. And I don't have to test against it because the endpoints stay the same, right? And yeah, versioning endpoints, and there's, again, all metaphor falls apart eventually. But the same thing, I can screw around over here all I want, as long as I'm doing the things that I want to. And so when we think about this from a blunt end, sharp end perspective, inside a squad of some kind, whatever the size of a team is where they have an amount of responsibility, they're at the sharp end. They know the best way to accomplish their outputs and their way of doing that. And we run into this challenge where we want to create this is the way we do everything in this organization. Now, there are places where, yes, we need to do things consistently, and especially when it comes to procurement and stuff. And sometimes, no, it doesn't make sense for every single development team in the organization to use a completely different source control system, necessarily, right? One of the things that I've basically found, because I get asked this question a lot, and they're like, at what point does it matter to, and I'm going off into a tool rant, and we'll stop that in a second. Basically, but I think it illustrates, as I said, the place when it makes sense or is necessary to have a common implementation of a tool or a tool to implement is where there's connection, right? If this tool is something that is interconnected between different squads, then yes, we have to come together on it. But if it's inside your domain and it doesn't leak out of there, for the most part, who cares, right? So again, which particular React part of the framework you choose to use, who gives a crap? The continuous delivery pipeline software use, yeah, we probably need to be consistent on that because squads come together. So again, this is going back to where that trust can come, but it comes with, you don't get it for free. In order to have that trust, you have to have an agreement. And I'm not talking about writing up some SLA between each other and stuff, but it's just sort of saying, these are the inputs, these are the outputs. Again, probably at least the third or fourth time today, you're hearing about psychological safety and the DORA State of DevOps report and all this other kind of stuff, so I'm not going to dig into it too much. But one of the things that I don't even put the year of the State of DevOps report that I put this up on, because it's been in almost every one. But the trick is it says that the culture of psychological safety is what's been predictive of software delivery performance, organizational performance, and productivity. This is reinforced. I guess it's reinforced even though this happened before the DORA report. Years ago, Google ran an internal analysis project. They said, we want to figure out what makes our high-performing software teams high-performing. And this was called Project Aristotle. And they did all this research, said, okay, what do these teams have in common, the high-performing teams? Was it their level of expertise in the industry? Was it them sitting next to each other, being co-located? What they found that was the unifying theme was a high level of psychological safety. And what exactly is psychological safety? It's this. According to Amy Edmondson from Harvard Business School, so it's a sense of confidence that the team will not embarrass, reject, or punish someone for speaking up. It's that simple. That's all there is to it, right? It's saying that if I speak up. And it doesn't mean even argue. It's just saying, if I say something, do I feel confident that I am not going to get in trouble? I'm not going to be made fun of. I'm going to be heard. That is the number one most important thing for a team to have high performance. We did an exercise within my team that my boss and his directs last week where we sat down, it was sort of all about me, like how do you work with me, blah, blah, blah. And one of the slides was about high performing teams and what do we think is, for you as the individual, leader of this group, what is the most important thing for a high-performing team? And I said, psychological safety. I said, I could go on about this for an hour, and I have. They are talks. Okay, so here's the deal, right? So if we kind of look at these 4 zones of performance, and we say if we kind of map these things out between accountability is real important. People want this, right? Especially leaders are like, you should have accountability for the work that you do. So on the axes of accountability on one side and psychological safety on the other, this goes to show that the two things, you can't just have accountability, because if we have a state of high accountability where you are held accountable for everything you do, but your psychological safety is low, what is that a recipe for? Anxiety, right? Because I'm like, I can't do it. And then on the other side of the world, you can have low, and I mean, that's probably fine, but you aren't going to get a lot of stuff done, right? If there's no accountability and no psychological safety, you got people just sort of, resting, investing, I guess. And then a high psychological safety with no accountability, though, is comfort, which as an individual for a little while feels pretty good. You're like, okay, that's cool. I can kind of do my thing, but I'm just sort of doing my thing. So the high-performing, a generative learning place is when there is high accountability and high psychological safety. When the psychological safety is low, we run into this lack of, these are symptoms or things that happen. If we don't really have a diversity of voice, how many times we sort of sit there, and so we end up going for the least controversial statement, right? That, okay, well, I'm not going to bring this up, so we're just going to sort of go to that lowest common denominator, but also means when we don't have that diversity of voice and diversity of experience, people with different backgrounds of all kinds of ways will bring things up, things that someone who looks like me wouldn't even think about, right? There's constant examples of this with a lot of smart home technology and stuff where someone who has had my experience wouldn't even think about how these things can be leveraged in an abusive way, right? But how are you going to bring that up if you don't have psychological safety? Those teams are not equipped to mitigate failure as well because we don't want to rock the boat. We see a risk, we're not going to speak about it. It amplifies the idea of deviance, normalization of deviance, right? Which is normalization of deviance, and the inability to speak up is what brought us the Challenger disaster, right? Hopefully we don't have those levels of risks in our software projects, but still. We run into knowledge silos, right? We keep information to ourselves, and it's actually a form of protection. And then ultimately, there's indifference and disengagement. When we think about doing any kind of a change, I like to talk about people being committed versus being compliant. And you're not going to get everybody to always agree with everything, and that's not important. But if we're trying to drive innovation forward and change, we need to be committed. And commitment comes from being heard. One of the, you can talk over we want about Amazon's leadership principles, but one is disagree and commit, and you can only do disagree and commit when you have high psychological safety, so that disagree is not just, your objection is noted, go to hell, we're doing this instead. That's not what disagree and commit means. So we have to have trust within our teams, within that boundary of the squad. How do we trust each other? How do we trust our direct colleagues and our direct leaders? But also, trust of the teams, right? So we expand this to how do teams trust each other? And we're going to delve into one and then the other. So trust within a team. When we're talking about my software delivery team, my SRE team, my folks who we're on the weekly team meeting together, right? We're all together. How do we have trust ourselves? So this is really key. So Dave Shackelford said, it's hard to make meaningful progress until people feel heard. And heard does not mean agreed with, as he says. You get this physical relaxation response happens when you believe that your point of view has been understood and acknowledged. not agreed with. Agreed with is not actually the key, but the key is you heard me and you acknowledged and you understood it. That's disagree and commit as well, by the way. You have to have that. You have to say like, okay, I understand your point, and not just glibly, I understand your point, but okay, I heard that, and I understand it this way. Okay, and then we kind of can continue our conversation. And when you know you've been heard, you kind of do this, okay, we're having a conversation. Couple other tips here. I like to say you approach conflict as a collaborator, right? Not an adversary. This is really hard to do. I struggle with this in my daily life constantly when we have conflict. Last night, I had one of my kids' friends' dad called me, and I was all ready to, this was gonna be a fight. And I was like, wait a minute, no, I really like this guy. We both care about our kids. We're on the same team here, right? We are collaborators. It's not that I have to win and be right, because the reality is we were both right, and it was our kids who were wrong. Also, that's my daughter going to her first concert ever a year ago. So, if you would like to see her give a conference talk, she'll be speaking at DevOps Day Chicago in August, and I will talk more about that at the end. We speak human to human. We're all people together. So the phrase, just like me, is powerful. Now, we are not all exactly the same, but we are more the same than we are not. We are all still humans with a human experience. And when we're working together, it's one of those little things, you know how they're like, if you smile enough, you'll get in a good mood. If you find yourself saying this word when you're like working with someone, and you don't have to say it out loud, but just say like, oh, Amy is a software engineer just like me. You're like, okay, we're reinforcing our commonality. I really like the idea of replacing blame with curiosity, right? We don't know everything. We don't have all the facts in a situation. So we're investigating together. We're not looking for like, how do we figure out whose fault it is? We're saying, I actually want to learn more things. You know more things than I do about the situation. How do we get that curiosity going? And as engineers and technologists and also just humans, curiosity is powerful and we can do a lot more with it. And then how do we model our vulnerability? And this is something that is more incumbent upon leaders because it's hard. And people say, how can I help to enhance more psychological safety in my team as a leader? Well, you can't just say we're going to do it. You have to display. I'll give one story example of this. And I wasn't a manager at the time, but I was on our sales engineering team when I was working at Chef. And one of my coworkers, who's a very sharp guy, great friend of mine, and he sang at my wedding. Love this guy. And he was having a hard time with something. He couldn't figure something out. And he's like, I don't understand. I'm trying to SSH in this machine, and it's not working. And finally it was like, oh, I capitalized the flag instead of lowercase. And I jokingly said, oh, Sean, what kind of dummy wouldn't know how to do blah, blah, blah. And it was in good jest, and he was not offended or upset because, first of all, he knows he's 3 times as smart as I am. But my manager came to me later that day, and he said, look, Matt, I know that you and Sean are good friends. I know that Sean probably thought it was funny, or at the minimum wasn't offended. But what you just told the whole team is, when you make a mistake, Maddie will make fun of you. And that's not okay. And that's the thing to watch for, is it's those little things like that. Because broadly speaking, we'd be like, no, I don't punish people for speaking up. I don't give people, but we don't think that, because we don't say things. I mean, that was probably actually a pretty blatant one where I said, what kind of, but it's little things like that to kind of watch for. But then if we create those emotional bonds and showing vulnerability, that helps show that safety. So then when we think about the trust of the teams, and gonna not go as deep into this, there's more, this is larger organizational structure, but when we kind of think about a couple of the different ways to structure this, right? So Jim Whitehurst from Red Hat has a great book called The Open Organization, which I really love to think about how things can work together. And like all things, is probably more aspirational than practical in many ways. My other aphorism about this is all business books can be summarized in a blog post. But in a conventional organization that is that top down, the what is pushed down a lot more, right? And what we have is, again, this command and control. We think about central planning for the whole organization, and we're pushing that down kind of through our frozen middle all the way down to our individual contributors. So what you run in down here at the sharp end, in this case it's sharp, it's funny, it's flipped over there, but that's okay. So the why at that point is promotion and pay, right? Why am I doing this? Because that's the only reason. Now, this is a damn good reason to do work, by the way. I'm not saying anybody here has to do it for free, because I don't think any of us in this room would be doing any of the shit we do if they didn't pay us. But, so that's fine. This is not against it, but that's like the only reason, right? And then what you have is in the middle, it's around building that hierarchy, our title and rank, and that how is again pushed down. In an open organization, you have to have, right? This is not this flat organization with no structure, but what we're doing at the top is around setting direction rather than defining the what. And it's around decision making, and then kind of, again, it's bottom up, because at the sharp end, we understand the how and the why. And so we have that purpose and passion, and really in the middle, you're an enabler. One of the things that happens up here that gets really hard for folks at the top, especially in a traditional organization, is a lot of this is, well, this is need to know. Not everybody needs to know all of this. And the reality is, most of the stuff that's truly need to know, it's a much shorter list than we really think it is. But it has to do with siloing for power. And this is sort of what has happened in traditional organizations. This is where those silos came from that we have been trying to break in DevOps for 12 to 13 years. But we end up with these sort of functions. And again, they come from, silos exist for protection. That's why silos exist in the real world, in farms, right? Silos are not inherently bad. But we sit there and say, because I have this jurisdiction, I can control it, and I can make sure that everything I'm responsible for is fine. Because as soon as those silos get leaky, people can maybe mess up my world, and then I've got that accountability towards it. And so it's really this downstream effect of Conway's law. And then an open organization, a lot of it still is that bottom up, but it's really, if we think about the concepts we're trying to accomplish in DevOps, it's all about feedback loops. In order to do these feedback loops, we have to be cross-functional, because it's the only way that we understand it. One of the things I explained in my little how to work with me thing is I said, while I run a DevRel program and I work in marketing, I'm like, everything is still a DevOps problem. And I've been having lots of conversations about cross-functional teams within our marketing department. So I'm going to take a quick deviation here. We're going to talk about this guy, Chris Farley. And I will tell you, when Chris Farley first came on SNL, which is my first real exposure to him, I didn't really like him. I thought he was too broad. There are a lot of things I didn't like, until I started to learn about his history in Chicago improv. And I watched these like blurry VHS tapes of him at Improv Olympic, and the man was a genius. And the reason was because he was such a good listener, right? You would watch him do a scene, and he would bring stuff back 20 minutes later that had come up, because he was actually focused on being a great partner. And so this clip, this sort of gif, is from a sketch he used to do on SNL called The Chris Farley Show, where it was supposed to be him. He would interview celebrities on his talk show, and he'd be really nervous about meeting Paul McCartney or whomever, but it would always be stuff like, hey, do you remember when you were in that band Wings? Yeah, that was awesome. And from people I have met who knew Chris, they said that's what it was like to know him. Because he was like that in real life. He would bring something up that happened to you 10 years ago together, because he was constantly paying attention and being a great partner. Versus Michael Scott from The American Office, who is a terrible improviser. If you've seen this scene, I don't have time to show the whole thing, but the point was, every time when Michael was doing improv, he made everything about himself and tried to center it, and as he, pull out fake guns and all sorts of things. When I was studying improv in my first class, we actually had someone in our class very similar to Michael. And I remember in one scene we were doing, about halfway through, he got locked in a refrigerator in the scene. And at the end of the scene, the instructor said, Jason, do you know why they locked you in the refrigerator? It's because we just had to get him shut down, because he was off doing his own thing. And this connection comes back to how we collaborate as teams. So TJ Jadowski was my instructor at Improv Olympic. If you know the Sonic ads with the two guys sitting in the car, TJ's one of them. I learned a lot from TJ. One comment he made once, we said, improv is like driving while only looking in the rearview mirror. We only know what has already happened. Guess what else is like that? Life. work we do as a team, we can have all these ideas of things we're going to do, but all we know is what we've already done. We can have predictions, but we don't know what's going to happen because the work we do as a group is not scripted. We're improvising it. We're making it up as we go, and we're building it together. There's an idea we talk about in improv, but it's true for everything. We talk about the idea of bring a brick, not a cathedral. And what that means in an improv scene is I may have an idea of what I want to do, and I may start doing a scene with you, and then you take it somewhere else. And I can't shut you down because now we're negating each other. So if I come in with a full-formed cathedral of what I want to have happen, and then something changes, I'm not building it with you. Now, those cathedrals I build, they might get a laugh. You might think what I said was funny, but it's not collaborative. So what we're doing instead is I'm building the bricks. We're building the cathedral together, and this comes to how we work together as a team within the tech that we build as well. We may say, but you know how we really need to design this like robust fault-tolerant systems? We have to do it this way, and I've got the whole thing figured out. Okay, come with the bricks. How do we take these ideas of improv and how do we apply them to DevOps? Trust in your partner, one of the most important things, and improv is being a great partner, and that involves trust. You're working with great people, right? Okay, I know you might have some people you work with who are not great. Okay, it's fine, not everybody's great, but let's pretend for a minute. But generally speaking, we're all here to do great work, and we build better together than by ourselves. There are no mistakes. We could put a picture of Bob Ross up here. The best thing about a mistake is we now know something we didn't know before, right? So this is not like move fast and break things and just screw shit up all over the time. But hey, what happened, if something happened that seems like it was a mistake, we now know something we didn't know before, especially about our systems that are not very good at talking to us. The team is greater than all of us. Right? Your reach should exceed your grasp. This is better than the sum of all the parts. This happens in improv scenes. You'll sit and you'll say, how did we do this together? I didn't even know. You watch a great scene, you're like, they had to have figured that out. And having done long form, you'll walk off and say, where the heck did that come from? And this happens with us. Again, we're building those bricks. The team is greater than all of us together. And this one I kind of love. It's the fun lies on the other side of yes. You know, and you probably heard you say yes and, you don't say no. Okay, sometimes in the real world we say no, but the fun happens when we agree to do something together and go make something. Doesn't mean you say yes all the time, especially if you're an open source maintainer, as Just Frizzell likes to say, you know, no is temporary, yes is forever, but the fun happens on the other side of yes. And so when we think about the idea, if you think about it in a scene, the players are at the sharp end, the people that are doing the work are the sharp end. And I want to kind of leave with this. So this is Del Close, who is one of the founders of Improv Olympic. When he passed away, he willed his skull to the Steppenwolf Theater for use in productions of Hamlet, which I think is pretty cool. But other than that, he says, you know, if we treat each other as if we're all geniuses, poets, and artists, we have a better chance of becoming that. And I think that's really important in the work that we do. If we treat everyone we work with as genius architects, as brilliant programmers, as innovative SREs, we have a better chance of actually becoming that together and building it together. There's 4 things you can do right now to move forward. I think it's important in a team. I believe in establishing, sometimes I call this a social contract or rules of engagement. I do this with any team that I build, where we sit down collaboratively and say, this is how we work together. And some of it's as mundane as, do we have cameras on or off on Zoom? How do we communicate with each other off times? All of those things. The important thing, if you're the manager, you don't write this. You don't define it. The team comes up with it together. Creating space for open communication. This is even harder in our remote place, and you have to have an intentionality around this. I'm going a little bit quick because I'm running out of time. Don't worry, I'm going to give you a link to where the slides are. Measure consistently for long-term improvement. It's not that important about what you're measuring as long as you're consistent and you don't change your metrics every 3 months, because you're not going to see where it's moving. And then I really love the idea of, so guardrails matter. I believe strongly in making the right way the easy way. the gravity of that, but like they talk about in the DevOps handbook, they say buoys over boundaries. And what that means is so those guardrails are not necessarily brittle, but you're moving past them with intentionality, just like a buoy. The buoy is not preventing me from swimming out into that part of the water, but I'm taking my own known responsibility for doing that. So this has been really fun. My name is Maddie. These are places you can find me. If you want to get links to the slides, that's what that QR code will give you. I have one more thing to before we get into questions. So I also, among all the other things I do that don't make me any money, I'm also the creator, the founder, and I still run DevOps Day Chicago, which is a fun conference here in Chicago in August. But other than that, excited and happy to take questions and thoughts, problems with your life.